And so a lot of organizations, when they start on the Azure cloud, they look at the cloud adoption framework from Microsoft, which is a set of documentation with a lot of best practices on how to adopt and move into the Azure cloud. So I'll quickly go over the pillars in here and then to show you where actually landing zones fit in and where it actually shows up. So first of all, we start in the strategy phase, which is the place where you as an organization start to think about, all right, so we want to move to the cloud. Why do we actually want to move there? What are our business objectives? What do we want to achieve by actually moving into the cloud? If you then still want to move forward, you head on into the plan phase. This is where you actually establish, for example, your digital estate. What are the systems that we have or actually planning to build that we actually want to move into the Azure cloud? But it's not just technical, right? Technical is often the quite easy part of doing migrations, etc. It's also about organizational readiness. Do we have the skills required to actually make such a move? And then, when we actually want to move into Azure, we get into the ready phase. And this is the phase where we prepare the environment, prepare Azure as a foundation for the rest of the organization to move into. And this is also where we then logically find the documentation around landing zones, because landing zones are there to build a foundation for other workloads to then move easily into the Azure cloud. So when that is sort of ready, when we have built that foundation, we move into the adopt phase, where we actually start migrating stuff, innovating, coming up with new ideas and moving stuff into the cloud on top of our landing zones. This is where you find things as the 5R model for migration and those kind of things in the cloud adoption framework. And all while you're going through the plan, ready, and adopt phase, you also go through the govern and manage phase, and you actually keep doing that for the length of your journey in Azure. So this is the phase where you, and the place where you find documentation around cost management, policy and compliance, which is obviously very important these days. This is where you think about identity baseline, those kind of things. But also in terms of management, this is where you find documentation recommendations around manageability of whatever you run. Things like performance, reliability, and availability of your cloud solutions. So we today will mostly be focusing on stuff that's in the ready phase in the cloud adoption framework, because that is the phase where you find stuff around landing zones. All right, so then what is a landing zone? This is the definition that I always want to use. And we say a landing zone is an environment for hosting workloads in the Microsoft Azure cloud, pre-provisioned through code. So it's a place to actually onboard workloads and make it easier for teams to start working in the Azure cloud. So what are workloads, you might be asking? So for me, a workload is an application or a service that we run in Azure. Could actually be a single application or multiple. But it's probably always a combination of applications or services that fulfill a business need as a whole. That's what we call a workload, and we want to host that on the Azure cloud. It doesn't really matter if that's an application that we bought from a vendor or that we built it ourselves. For the story today, it doesn't really matter. So when we talk about landing zones and when you read the documentation by Microsoft, you quickly find that they make a distinction between two types of landing zones. First of all, we have the application landing zones. That is where you will actually run your applications. That is where teams will actually build their new stuff and host it into the Azure cloud. But those application landing zones quite often need services to run. They might need connectivity to on-prem, they need connectivity into the internet, they need things like DNS, and they might need a bunch of other shared services. And you quite often find these in what we call the platform landing zones. So platform landing zones are the place where we host shared services, so that the application landing zones don't need to think about those, and they can just start using them. A while ago, we were building landing zones for a company that was in the seed development business. So they were developing seeds for vegetables, so for tomatoes, cucumbers, you name it. They were developing new varieties and those kind of things. And when we were building landing zones for them, we came up with this analogy that they understood to explain landing zones to them. and I think it's quite a strong one, so I want to use it here as well. So if you want to develop new seeds and vegetables, you obviously need soil to do that on, right? But you also need a gas line, probably electricity, and you of course need water to actually grow vegetables. So that is how I see Microsoft Azure for us as a foundation to build upon. They need soil, we need Microsoft Azure. But before you can actually start putting something in the ground and growing vegetables, you need stuff in place first, right? You actually need a path to get to your land. You might need lighting, etc. You need waste bins up in the top to actually dispose stuff, etc. So that's what I call the foundation before you can actually start growing vegetables. And for me, that resembles what we need in Azure as well, and we call it then the platform landing zones. We need a proper foundation to actually start doing our work. And on top of that, we can then start to actually grow vegetables, and we often do that in greenhouse lots, especially in the Netherlands where it's cold and too cold to, where it's very useful to have them. And for me, that's an analogy to application landing zones, where we build a foundation in Azure, and then the application users or application engineers use the application landing zones to actually build their environment in the cloud, using what we set up in the foundation for them to use. All right, so before we dive into the how and the best practices, why would you actually want to go through the whole thing around building landing zones and building this platform and those kind of things? So I think there's a few interesting reasons to actually do it. One is that using this method of landing zones and application landing zones gives you a very clear and a full separation around your workloads. We will see later that an application landing zone in Azure in terms of implementation often is being translated into a subscription. So a subscription is a very nice boundary of isolation for a particular workload in many, many forms, as we will see in a bit. If you do it right, it also becomes very easy to actually create a new application landing zone, which makes it very easy to teams to quickly start doing new stuff on the Azure cloud or innovate if they have an interesting idea. It shouldn't take months anymore, like we had on-prem, to actually get a virtual machine up and running. You should be able to have a landing zone in minutes for teams to be able to do their work. Because of the isolation that we achieve with building landing zones and handing out a lot of them, it's also very easy to review cost and also the environmental impact per application and per landing zone that we are deploying because they were isolated to begin with. It's also very easy to, in a very consistent manner, apply security measures and policies, etc., because we can easily do that automated across the board and apply that on every landing zone. But still be able to make small changes if that is really needed for a specific landing zone because it is isolated. So we can have a policy in place that says you can't do something, but maybe you actually need it for the specific landing zone, and because of the isolation, we can actually do that quite easily. And especially for organizations that use a nice agile and DevOps way of working, it also gives application teams a place, a landing zone, where they can be self-supporting, where they can have a place to autonomously build their applications in guardrails, of course, but still have enough permissions and power to build that stuff in a self-supporting way within their own isolated boundary. So for me, a landing zone should really focus on increasing developer productivity while still being in control and make sure that everyone adheres to the rules and the policies and the guardrails that we put in place. We will see throughout the talk how we can give landing zone owners, or users actually, enough permissions and freedom to do their work, but still ensure that they are in the boundaries of, well, the organization. I am currently working in one of the largest hospitals in the Netherlands to roll out this foundation to build landing zones. And you can imagine that staying within boundaries and adhering to policies and security guardrails is, especially in such an environment, very, very, very important. All right, so throughout the presentation, we're gonna talk and dig into various design areas that have a relation with landing zones, and I'm going to show you how we most often build those things. So let's start with resource organization. I already sort of told you that application landing zones and landing zones in general in Azure translate into subscriptions. So why is that? Let's talk about deployment scopes in Azure. As you might know, in Azure there's a whole hierarchy for you to use to organize your resources, right? So it starts with management groups on the top. You can actually have management group in management groups to create a nice structure. Management groups can contain one or more subscriptions. Subscriptions can contain one or more resource groups. And most resources in Azure, not all of them, but most resources in Azure are actually being deployed into a resource group. And as I said, it turns out that subscriptions are the ideal unit of isolation to hand out landing zones. There's a few reasons for it, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. So, subscriptions provide this nice management boundary when it comes to both governance, cost, and isolation in the system. So, what we, for example, have seen in the past is that organizations used resource groups as the mechanism for landing zones. So they would hand out a resource group to a team to do their work and put all the workloads in a single subscription. You quite quickly run into a few limits there. One is that teams want to be able to organize their resources themselves. If you give a team a resource group, then there's nothing left for them to organize resources, right? They have a single resource group, that's what they have to work with. If you give them a subscription, they can create resources themselves like they think should work with their product, and you give them a way to organize their stuff. And if you look at your Azure bill, for example, then the subscription level is also the default level that you will see in your Azure bill. And also that's also the billing scope that you hook into in the Azure platform. So also from a billing perspective, it's very useful and very wise to use the subscription as the level of isolation. Another reason to do this is that in Azure, the subscription is often the place where platform limits are being set. So there are various limits in Azure that dictate that you can, for example, have 20 CPUs of a specific kind. Well, that is a limitation on the subscription level. So if you put all workloads in a single subscription, you would quite quickly run into those kind of limits. And I gave the example of the CPU limit. That's one that you can especially nowadays, quite easily up. But there's quite a few more limits on the subscription level that you can't change. So subscription also, therefore, is an ideal level of deployment scope to work with. And you can actually create unlimited number of subscriptions. So there's no scale issue there. So if we dig into the different type of landing zones. So first look at platform landing zones, and later we will talk about application landing zones. What is it that we see typically being deployed in either one of them? What does it look like in practice? So here you see an overview of platform landing zones. And what you will see right away is that we have 3 different subscriptions. There is a connectivity subscription, an identity subscription, and a management subscription. There is a separation between the 3 because especially in large organizations, we see that different teams are responsible for these different things. So then it also makes sense to have different subscriptions because then we can make the correct team the owner of that subscription and manage the services within those subscriptions. So again, the subscription is a nice boundary there for isolation on permissions as well. In a connectivity subscription, we typically see things like maybe web application firewalling, connectivity to on-prem, DNS firewalling, all these connectivity shared services that will be used by application owners later on to connect to on-prem, for example, or to the internet, those kind of things. In the identity subscription, we, for example, find things like domain controllers, although more and more organizations no longer have the need for them because they do it purely cloud native, but that would be the place where you would probably host those. And in the management subscription, we find things around Sentinel, central logging to log analytics, and those kind of things. You might be wondering, why is there a one-on-one relation between subscription and management group in this image? Well, that is because this shows a single region deployment. Imagine that you would deploy landing zone platforms into multiple regions, then you would probably get a subscription per region to host the particular workloads or the particular systems in that region. And then if you, for example, have 2 management subscriptions in 2 separate regions, it makes sense to have it in a single management group, so you can still apply permissions on that level, for example, and make that work on the underlying subscriptions. If we then look at the other side, the application landing zones, and this is what we typically see there. We typically hand out a production subscription, so a production landing zone, and a non-production landing zone. And within those landing zones, teams get to build their different environments. So maybe they build dev and test in non-prod, and maybe they build acceptance and production in the production subscription. We often look at what is the type of data you're going to process, because that will dictate where your environment should land. If you are using production data in your acceptance environment, then it should go into the production subscription, for example. So typical things that you find in these subscriptions are log analytics workspace, so you can store your logs and metrics, which are then quite often also being sent into a central place for central monitoring. You of course find a virtual network, so you can do private networking, which is then connected to the central network, which is your outbound into the public internet or on-prem network, those kind of things. So that's one of those shared things, right? You don't need to do connectivity to on-prem yourself. You are connected to a central place that will give you the opportunity to go to on-prem or the internet or to other landing zones, of course. And maybe, for example, a key vault, so you can start storing secrets from the get-go. And then it's up to the teams themselves to actually start deploying the resources in Azure that they need. So maybe they need a virtual machine to host their workload. Maybe they need a SQL database, storage account, AKS cluster, you name it. They get the groundwork in the landing zone, and then they can start building and deploying whatever they need for their specific application to run on top. And of course, there's a variety of things that you could add or not. So for example, in my current assignment, we also add Grafana and add a few default dashboards into the mix. But it really depends on your scenario, what is the default that you want to give application owners in the application landing zones. All right. We talked a bit about resource organization in a previous slide, and I mentioned that for every landing zone, every workload, we hand out 2 subscriptions. So that actually means that in larger organizations, you're going to be handing out a lot of subscriptions, which is fine, right? As long as we do it in an automated fashion, etc. But it does require organization around the placement of those landing zones. So we need to think about the grouping mechanism in Azure and how we're going to use it. So this is an example of how you could be using management groups to organize yourselves in Azure and then organize the landing zone. So this is a typical setup that we see. There's a separation between platform landing zones and application landing zones. That's quite often being done because, for example, there are different policies being applied here on the platform than we apply on the landing zones for our users. So then we can apply policies on the landing zones on the platform, which are separate from each other. So this is where most of the landing zones then will be hosted. And what you often see is a place for sandboxes, so people can play around with, for example, no policies. And there's often a place for decommissioned subscriptions. Because if you cancel a subscription, if you decommission a subscription, it will stay around for, I think it's 60 days. So you need a place to sort of get it out of the way while it's actually being canceled. So this is just a way to do your organization in management groups. I also see organizations use management groups per department in their organization. So I have a finance one, have a HR one, whatever. I've also seen organizations who do this model, but then go a level deeper and do a management group per region. So have one for Western Europe, have one for the United States, whatever. It all depends on how you want to organize things, how you, for example, want to apply policies, permissions, those kind of things. And it's good to know it's not set in stone. You can change it sort of live. You can also move subscriptions between management groups, etc. So start somewhere and then adjust on the go would probably work here. All right. We already said that you're probably gonna need to deploy a lot of subscriptions, a lot of landing zones, right? So that means that you need to have a mechanism to properly do that. That is why you need what we call a subscription vending mechanism, a way to programmatically issue new subscriptions to application teams to make sure that they can very quickly onboard and that you are, as a central team, not the bottleneck in this endeavor. So you need a streamlined process for teams to quickly onboard and a very efficient process. So on a high level, moving into landing zones is being shown in the image here. So you first need platform subscriptions to create the platform. Then you can start with subscription vending for application landing zones so application owners can deploy their workloads. If we dive in a bit deeper, then this is a process that you could follow, and it's quite similar to what we actually do at the hospital these days. So we have this team, the Cloud Center of Excellence, and we indeed established a process around moving into Azure and being allowed to actually have a landing zone. You need to go through a few hoops before you can actually onboard on Azure. When we approve, the application team can request a new landing zone. The platform team puts that in place, configures networking, actually deploys the landing zone, and then it's up to the application team to start deploying their workload in the new landing zone. Before they start doing that, it's wise to have a few rules around resource organization again. So it's wise to have a naming convention. Naming is always very hard, but in Azure it's even harder because Microsoft keeps changing names of products. But in Azure, most of the resources you can't rename, right? If you want to rename something, you need to delete it and create it again. I think the subscription is actually the only thing that you can rename without destroying it. All the other things you need to destroy. So coming up with a proper naming scheme is important to make sure you can create unique names for the services per landing zone, and you can actually recognize them and those kind of things. But you cannot put every detail that you probably want to put in a name to recognize it. You can't put it in a name because a lot of resources in Azure have a quite hard limit on the length of the name, for example. A key vault can only be 24 characters in length. A storage account can't include the dashes. And there's a whole bunch of other things that you need to take into account. So it's also important to have a tagging strategy in place so that all the additional information that you need from resources can be added into tags, which can then be used for more sophisticated filtering and reporting on those resources beyond the name itself. So things that we put in tags are data classification, business criticality, the cost center, the owner is a very important one to be able actually to find who is actually owning the resource. Those kind of things are ideal to put into tags. All right, so now that we started handing out application landing zones to users, we want to give them enough freedom to do their work, to work autonomously, but they also need to adhere to a few rules, right? We need to keep them sort of in control. So that is where, amongst other things, role-based access control comes into play. So this is typically an identity model that we use when talking about landing zones. So again, we have the production subscription, the production landing zones, and the non-production one. And the first thing that we need to have in place is a way to deploy into those landing zones, right? That should always be done in an automated fashion. So you will probably be using things like GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps, those kind of products to deploy automatically into the landing zones, which means that, for example, Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions need permissions to deploy into landing zones, right? These days, we can nicely do that via managed identities, but those managed identities need particular permissions or particular role on the landing zones, right? And they need quite high privilege roles because they also need to be able to give permissions to other identities, for example. So that's why the managed identities need the owner role, or what we quite often do, a custom owner role. We'll get to that in a bit. But besides the automation, there's also actually people working with these environments, right? So what we often do is, on the non-production environment, we give application owners or engineers also permissions to work there manually, to try out stuff, to see how stuff should be built, etc. But in production, they of course don't get permissions to modify anything because they should do that via automation to begin with. But to do their work, they need things like reader action, maybe of reader rights, maybe billing reader, those kind of things. And higher level privileges, which they might sometimes need if stuff goes wrong, we do that via what we call privileged identity management. So a flow which allows them to get more permissions if they need to, but it always needs to be reviewed by a colleague, for example. So we can put a nice process in place for them to be able to get the high privilege permissions, but still through a proper process. So we talked a bit about the custom role that we can assign, because owner is quite often too much. If you give someone the owner role, that means that that person or that identity can also make other people or groups owners. And that is something that you do not want. So what we can do is, for example, create a custom role in which we say you can do everything except for a few things. And in this example, we limit, for example, the fact that this role cannot write any authorization things, so it cannot assign rules to anyone else. But you can also do things like, I don't want you to be able to create a public IP address because I don't want you to expose resources to the internet directly. So you can create custom rules to work around the problem of being a full owner. And again, this is to still give enough permissions to do their work, but keep control over what they can do at full. You can also go much more in depth when setting these permissions. Nowadays, you can set conditions on permissions. And this is an example where we say, all right, you have permissions on the storage account, but you can only read from it, or you can write, but only if the container name equals a particular variable. So you can be very picky on storage account these days where you want people to actually be able to write. So using these conditions, custom rules, we can actually establish a nice way of working for teams, giving them enough permissions to work with. So apart from the owner, etc., we also have readers. Product owners, for example, are mostly in that group. And we often see that there's also a group, a more central group doing security things, for example. So they need permissions on the whole management group to see security information, those kind of things. You might be thinking, if we start handing out these custom owner permissions, then people can actually do kind of everything in the cloud and build whatever they want to. And maybe we don't want that. Especially in a hospital, you don't want it. So that is where Azure policies come in. And a policy is a way for you to enforce what people can and cannot do in the Azure cloud. So here's an example of a single policy definition. And this definition says, if you are deploying a resource, and this resource you are deploying is not being deployed to Western Europe, then we are going to deny that deployment. So this policy says you can only deploy into Western Europe. If you try to deploy anywhere else, we'll deny it. And you can think of all different kinds of policies, right? Enforcing a particular SSL versions, enforcing HTTPS, you name it. There's a lot of policies built into the platform for you to regulate what people can and cannot do. Those policies are often being grouped into what we call initiatives. And so it's a group of policies, and you get to assign that onto a particular scope so that it becomes effective. And we often assign these policy initiatives to the highest level we can, so it applies to whatever is underneath, right? So most policy initiatives are being applied to the landing zone management group, for example, so that it applies to any landing zone we deploy in the system. You can always create an exemption on a lower level if you need to, but by default, policies apply to anyone deploying stuff into the Azure cloud. Apart from these technicalities around implementing landing zones, you also, as an organization, need to think about your operating model. What does it mean for my organization? How do I actually want to let people work with Azure and landing zones, etc.? And Microsoft describes 4 ways or 4 operating models in the cloud adoption framework. And there's no right or wrong. You need to find the one that actually matches what you are trying to achieve as an organization. So we'll quickly go over them. So first of all, there's decentral operations, which basically means there is nothing central, there is no landing zone, there is no platform. It's free for all with everyone on its own. Which is ideal for innovation, right? You can do whatever you want, so you can very quickly innovate. But that quite quickly won't work in larger organizations. It's not effective. Another one is central operations, where you basically have a single landing zone and you have a single team operating that landing zone for everyone else who wants to deploy anything into Azure. So there's no autonomy, there's no decentralization, but it is still useful in various scenarios. So I, for example, used to work for KLM, and my team was the team that manages all the third-party applications in Azure. And their first idea was to give all the application owners a landing zone and make them host those applications themselves. But it was often a business unit that bought an application. They didn't know anything about hosting that thing in Azure. They couldn't do that. So we became the central team hosting the application for the other teams. So instead of you build it, you run it, it became you bought it, we run it. So that was a nice example of doing central operations, which makes sense for that scenario. But most organizations we find here in the democratization one, where we have a platform where we have multiple landing zones that can host multiple workloads and have full autonomy with workload teams to actually deploy their stuff into Azure. And you can also actually do a combination of those things if you need to. That's what we actually did at KLM, right? We had central operations for our team, but then separate landing zones for all the other teams. So you can actually also do a combination of the two. One thing that I do see at some organizations is that they try to do in Azure what they were doing and used to on-prem. On-prem, they used to have a central team that manages everything, so that is also what we're going to do in the cloud. And then they start building portals and tools on top of Azure and giving that to developers as the way to actually work with Azure and creating resources, sort of becoming their own cloud provider. And that has always turned out to be counterproductive. So don't do that. Go for proper landing zones, ensure that teams can be fully autonomous on the Azure cloud within the guardrails, of course. But cloud is completely different from on-prem, so it also requires a completely different operating model. So we haven't really talked about one of the essential pieces in landing zones, which is networking, right? Networking is basically everywhere when we're talking about landing zones. And when you start implementing landing zones, there's a few network topologies that you could pick from to do so. So the most famous one is probably hub and spoke, where we have a simple or a central hub, and all the other VNets are connected to the central hub, and all traffic flows through the central hub. It's ideal for central control because that is where we can do firewalling and those kind of things. Another way to do it is mesh, where basically any network is connected to any other network, so no centralization at all, or a combination between the two. The one that I see most is hub and spoke with a little bit of mesh. So sometimes, for reasons, you do create connections between two individual VNets, between two individual landing zones, but most traffic goes through the hub for central inspection and those kind of things. When you start doing this on Azure, and I need to hurry up a little, you basically have two ways of implementing a hub and spoke topology. There is the what we call traditional, where you do everything manual, and there is these days a sort of product on Azure to do that, which is called the Virtual One. It's an abstraction on top of doing it manually, so it takes away a lot of configuration and a lot of complexity for you, and makes it just work when you start connecting networks, especially across regions. So I had a slide prepared around where it's very useful, but the gist of it is within Virtual One, there is simply far less configuration that you need to do. You get a level of abstraction on top of networking, and with every abstraction, you need to do less, you need to pay Microsoft, and you get less control. So there's upsides and downsides with going for a level of abstraction. But for most organizations that we see, Virtual One is the way to go because it makes your life so much easier. Then we need to think around how do we let landing zones communicate either with each other or with the public internet. And there's basically sort of two models that you can go for. One is we send all traffic via the Azure firewall in the central hub, and the firewall says no by default, it's deny by default, and we need to allow specific traffic. It's probably the most secure model because you deny by default and need to explicitly open up communications. You can also actually, at least for internal traffic, not go through the central firewall, but use network security groups on the landing zones to dictate what and what cannot go in. But that requires a high level of professionalism within each landing zone when it comes to networking. And that's often not in place enough. So this is the model that most organizations tend to go through. All traffic going from landing zone to landing zone or to the public internet is being sent through the central firewall. All right, I have 40 seconds left for my final slide, so we're almost there. I'm gonna be 1 minute late or so. So we talked about the central part, right, where we have networking, firewalling, those kind of things. But we quite often see that we quite quickly already expand that central offering, so to say, with additional services as well, so that application landing zone owners don't need to, before it's gonna buzz, so that they don't need to care about these kind of services. So, for example, Application Gateway, which is a product in Azure to expose your web application to the public internet, that's a typical service to host centrally. There's two reasons for it. It's quite a complex resource to manage. So doing that centrally means that application owners don't need to worry about the complexity. It's also quite expensive to deploy that thing into every single landing zone. It's 260 euros a month, including a web application firewall. And that adds up. The story is sort of similar for API management. That is actually way more expensive. It's over 2,000 euros a month. So the cost alone is a reason to centralize that service. But it's again also a very complex one. So we often see that that is being brought into a central team to manage instead of having every landing zone owner do that for itself. And last but not least, we also see the same for Bastion, which is a service that allows you to log into virtual machines using HTTPS instead of SSH or RDP. So a more secure login to virtual machines. Also quite an expensive service. So that's why that's also quite often being offered centrally instead of per landing zones. Doing that, doing something centrally, has its pros and cons, right? I mean, less cost, central management, but also less autonomy for the actual individual teams. So you need to balance that out. All right, so we talked about these different levels of design decisions. And with that, we've come to the end of my talk, almost in time. If you have any questions, I'll be around at least today and tomorrow. If you want to contact me afterwards, LinkedIn is probably the best to do that. Also, feel free to connect if you want to for later things. And if you would like to rate my session, then please scan the QR code and leave your feedback. I always like to hear what your thoughts are, so I can actually also improve for next time. I have a session tomorrow around 4 on infrastructure from code, not as code, but from code. So if you want to know more about infrastructure and deployments and those kind of things, make sure to be there at 10 to 4 or something. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a nice conference.